In a cell in the Bastille, in the autumn of 1703, an old prisoner died whose face no living person was permitted to have seen. For 34 years he had been moved from fortress to fortress under the charge of a single jailer, and whenever other eyes were near, he had worn a mask, not iron, whatever the stories would later insist, but black velvet. When they buried him the next morning, a false name was written over the grave. He had been the most carefully guarded secret of the most powerful king in Europe, and he carried whatever he knew down into the dark. That king was Louis XIV of France, and the masked man is the right way to meet him. Because almost everything the world remembers about the Sun King is a kind of mask. The legend is all light. Louis the Magnificent, the Absolute, the master of Versailles, who danced as the sun god and made France the envy of the age, the king who supposedly declared that he himself was the state and ruled as though the whole of creation turned around his person. It is a dazzling story. It is also, in its way, a costume, one stitched deliberately in his own lifetime by an army of painters and poets and paid historians, and worn so well that it has fooled the world for 300 years. The truth beneath it is stranger and darker and far more human. It begins not with a god, but with a frightened child, hiding in a bed in the night while an angry city filed past to make certain he had not run away. He arrived like an answer to a prayer that had almost been abandoned. For 23 years, Louis XIII of France and his Spanish queen, Anne of Austria, had shared a throne and almost nothing else, a cold, estranged and childless marriage that had left the succession dangerously bare and the dynasty staring at extinction. When a son was at last born to them on the 5th of September 1638, the kingdom greeted the news as something close to a miracle. They christened him Louis Dieudonné, Louis the God-given. And the name was not mere flattery. To a France worn thin by war and haunted by the memory of religious slaughter, the child in the cradle at Saint-Germain looked like proof that heaven had not, after all, turned its face away. He would spend the rest of his life being told he was exceptional. He was not yet 5 years old when the first half of the promise came due. In May 1643, Louis XIII died, worn out by illness and a lifetime of hard rule under the shadow of his great minister, Cardinal Richelieu, who had gone to his own grave only months before. And so the crown of France passed to a boy of 4. He was proclaimed king before he could properly read, a small figure swallowed by the ceremony around him, and the real power passed, as it always did, in a royal minority, into other hands, into the regency of his mother, Anne of Austria, and, through her, into the supple, patient, and endlessly calculating grip of a new first minister, an Italian-born cardinal named Jules Mazarin. Mazarin was Richelieu's chosen heir, and he governed France as Richelieu had, by centralizing power, by squeezing the provinces for the money to fight a grinding war with Spain, and by trusting almost no one. He was brilliant, greedy, and cordially hated, and the resentment he gathered did not fall on him alone. It gathered around the throne itself, around the foreign queen and her foreign cardinal, and the silent boy in whose name they ruled. In 1648, that resentment broke open into rebellion, and France turned upon its own government in a series of revolts that would come to be known as the Fronde. The name was almost a mockery. A fronde was a child's sling, a toy for flinging stones, and the mockery ran in both directions. The rebels flung stones at royal authority, and royal authority dismissed them as children throwing tantrums. But the Fronde was no game. First, the sovereign courts of Paris, the Parlement, refused the crown's demands for money and asserted the right to check the king's will. Then the great nobles, princes of the blood, marshals of France, men with private armies and ancient grievances, saw their chance to claw back the independence that Richelieu and Mazarin had stripped from them, and threw the kingdom into open civil war. Paris rose. Paris. Barricades went up in the streets. The presses poured out thousands of savage pamphlets. The Mazarinades heaping filth on the cardinal, and, by implication, on the mother and child he served. It came in waves. The first, in 1648 and 1649, was the Fronde of the Parlement, a revolt of the Paris magistrates and the city behind them, which forced the court to flee to Saint-Germain in the January cold and to besiege its own capital until an uneasy truce was patched together. The second was worse. The Fronde of the princes drew in the highest blood of France, and above all, the greatest soldier of the age, Louis, the Prince de Condé, the king's own cousin, the victor of Rocroi, the general who had won France's wars, who turned from saviour to rebel, was imprisoned, was released, and at last carried his sword over to the enemy, fighting alongside the Spaniards against his own boy king. When the men who had saved the crown were the men now trying to seize it, no loyalty in the kingdom could be taken on trust, and more than once the court had to run. For the boy king, the years of the Fronde were an education in fear. Twice the royal family fled its own capital in the dead of night, slipping out of Paris ahead of the mob, taking to cold and unready country houses, while the city they had abandoned seethed behind them. He learned what it was to be a king whose subjects would not obey him, whose great nobles conspired against him, whose capital could turn on him like a wounded animal. He learned it not from books, but from the inside of fleeing carriages and the draughty rooms of borrowed chateaux. But one night, above all the others, marked him. It came in the winter of 1651, when a rumour ran through Paris that the Queen meant to spirit the young king out of the city under cover of darkness. The Parisians would not have it. They wanted their king where they could see him, a hostage, in effect, to their own good behaviour. And so a crowd of them forced its way into the royal residence, the Palais Royal, pushed past the guards, and demanded to see the boy with their own eyes. Rather than resist, the Queen made a colder choice. She had the doors to the royal bedchamber opened, and there, by the light of the intruders' lamps, the 12-year-old Louis lay in his bed and feigned sleep, breathing slow and even, while the men and women of Paris filed past his pillow one by one to satisfy themselves that their king had not escaped them. He did not stir. He gave them the performance they had come for. And when the last of them had shuffled out and the doors were shut again, the lesson had been written into him in a hand that would never fade, that a king could be made to lie still and pretend in his own palace in the dark for the reassurance of a mob. He never spoke of it as a wound. He did not have to. The whole shape of the reign to come would be its scar. For the rest of his long life, Louis would carry a deep and settled distrust of two things above all others: the city of Paris, which had humiliated him, and the high nobility of France, which had betrayed him. He would never feel safe inside the capital's walls. He would never again allow the great families of the realm the freedom they had used to make war on their own boy king. Where another ruler might have learned to court the city and conciliate the lords, Louis learned the opposite. He learned to watch them. The Fronde burned itself out at last, as such rebellions did, in exhaustion and mutual mistrust. The nobles fell out among themselves, the parlements lost their nerve, and Mazarin, twice driven into exile, returned each time more firmly in command than before. By 1653 the fires were out. The monarchy had survived, but the France it ruled had paid a hard price for 5 years of civil war. The countryside through which the rival armies had marched was picked over and burned. Villages had been plundered by the very soldiers meant to defend them. Harvests had failed, and hunger had followed the troops from province to province. The rebellion that had begun over the crown's demand for money had left the kingdom poorer, angrier, and no better governed than before. And the boy who had feigned sleep while his subjects paraded past his bed emerged from those years with his crown intact and his heart armoured. Yet the peace was Mazarin's, not the king's. Louis was still a youth, and the real government of France remained in the cardinal's aging hands. The great lessons of statecraft and sort of patience, of dissimulation, how money and fear and favour could be made to hold a kingdom together. Louis would learn at that same cardinal's knee in the years that followed, watching, always watching, and waiting for a power that was not yet his to take. He was 15 when they crowned him at Reims in the summer of 1654 in a kingdom that had twice driven him into the dark. But the boy who had lain still and feigned sleep while the mob filed past his bed had already learned the lesson that would govern his whole life. That a king who trusts his capital and his great nobles is a king who wakes to find them at his door. He never forgot it. And when the last of his teachers lay dead and the throne was at last his own, he would answer the terror of those years by building his enemies a cage of gold and teaching them to beg for the privilege of living inside it. The years that followed the collapse of the Fronde were a long apprenticeship in the arts of power. The rebellion had left Louis XIV, a crowned adolescent, whose government still belonged to another man, and that man, Cardinal Mazarin, Italian-born, supple, and endlessly patient, set himself to finishing the boy's education. It was not, in the main, an education in books. Mazarin taught the young king the mechanics of rule, how money moved through a kingdom, and where it could be found when a treasury ran dry, how favour might be spent like coin and withheld like a punishment, how a face could be schooled to give nothing away. Louis attended the council, read the dispatches at the cardinal's elbow, and watched. Contemporaries remarked on his reserve, a tall, grave young man who listened far more than he spoke, and who seemed content, for the present, to learn. The cardinal was worth learning from. He had governed France for the better part of 2 decades, through the Queen Mother's regency and through the years of revolt that had twice driven him into exile, and each time he had returned more firmly in command than before. He had grown, in the doing, into one of the wealthiest men in all of Europe, his residences crowded with paintings, sculptures, and tapestries, his coffers swollen with the profits of high office, even as the royal treasury he managed ran perpetually thin. He was brilliant, acquisitive, and cordially detested, and he wielded the resentment against him as a kind of shield, drawing every complaint toward his own person and away from the throne. Louis observed how the cardinal rewarded the compliant and starved the proud, how he set one great family against another, how patience and dissimulation could hold a fractious kingdom together where force alone had failed. These were the lessons of the apprenticeship, and the pupil absorbed them. The kingdom Louis was learning to govern was still at war. The long struggle with Spain that Richelieu had entered years before ground on through the 1650s, even after the fires of the Fronde had burned down, and much of Mazarin's craft in these years was bent upon paying for it, upon the loans, the sold offices, and the improvised taxes by which a nearly bankrupt crown kept its armies in the field. The king saw at close hand how thin the line ran between a solvent monarchy and a helpless one, and how much of the business of ruling came down in the end to the finding of money. But the apprenticeship was interrupted once by something the cardinal had not arranged. Among Mazarin's household were his nieces, the young women he had brought from Italy, and whom the court mocked as the Mazarinettes, married off, one by one, into the high blood of France. One of them was Marie Mancini. Through the last years of the 1650s, the king and the cardinal's niece were often in each other's company, and contemporaries recorded an attachment between them grave enough to alarm both Mazarin and the Queen Mother. An attachment the king was said to have wished to raise into a marriage. What Louis felt in those months belongs to the memoirists who described it, and cannot now be recovered with any certainty. What is certain is what was done. Reason of state did not permit a king of France to marry a cardinal's niece, whatever the cardinal's ambitions for his blood. Anne of Austria and Mazarin himself refused it. Marie Mancini was sent from the court in 1659, and the separation was remembered, in several later tellings, as a bitter one. The king did not defy the decision. He would be married where the interest of the crown required, and the crown required Spain. For a generation, France and Spain had bled each other in a war that had outlasted the men who began it, a grinding contest fought from the Netherlands to the Pyrenees. By 1659, both crowns were exhausted enough to end it. Mazarin met the Spanish First Minister, Don Luis de Haro, on a small island in the Bidassoa River, the Isle of Pheasants, a scrap of neutral ground set between the two kingdoms, and there, across long months of negotiation, the two men assembled the Peace of the Pyrenees. Signed in 1659, it was the crowning achievement of the cardinal's career, the settlement that ended a war older than the king himself, and it was to be sealed, as such treaties always were, with a marriage. The bride was Maria Theresa, eldest daughter of Philip IV of Spain, and she was Louis's double cousin, bound to him twice over by blood. Her father was the brother of his mother, Anne of Austria, and her late mother had been the sister of his father, Louis XIII. Cousins, already twice related, were now to be joined a third time by treaty. In June 1660, the two courts converged upon Saint-Jean-de-Luz, a small fishing town in the Basque country, near the border, and there Louis married the Infanta in a ceremony staged to proclaim to all of Europe the reconciliation of its two greatest Catholic powers. It was a spectacle of gold and silk and solemn processions, designed to announce that the long war was over and that France stood at the centre of the new peace. The two royal houses had not met on such terms within living memory. Philip IV of Spain, Louis's uncle by his mother's blood, and now his father-in-law as well, came in person to the frontier to give away his daughter. Beneath the pageantry lay a bargain that would outlast everyone who witnessed it. As a condition of the match, Maria Theresa formally renounced all claim to the throne of Spain and to the vast, failing empire that came with it. In return, Spain promised a dowry of 500,000 gold écus. The renunciation was to hold only so long as the dowry was paid, and Spain, its treasury as hollow as its ceremony, was proud, never paid it. The sum went largely unmet, and the renunciation it was meant to purchase was left resting upon a broken promise, a legal fuse laid quietly beneath the peace that France would one day return to light. For the present, none of it showed. The Queen was pious, gentle, and politically invisible, a woman who would spend her years at court as a symbol rather than a partner. The King performed the offices of a husband as he performed every public office, with a distant and practiced correctness, and turned back to the business of waiting. For the cardinal was failing. Gout and the strain of 30 years of government had worn Mazarin down, and the whole court could see it. Through the winter of 1660 and into the new year he declined by inches, still turning over his ledgers, still the first minister in name, and in fact still, by common report, the richest subject in Christendom, surrounded by the art and treasure he had spent a lifetime gathering. and as the old man sank, the old questions began to stir around his sick-bed. When Mazarin was gone, who would govern France? Which of the ministers would inherit the machine that Richelieu had built and Mazarin had perfected? The great families weighed their candidates and rehearsed their claims. The councillors measured one another. It was assumed, as it had always been assumed, that a king of France would be served by a chief minister, and that the real work of the state would pass, as it always had, into some other capable and grasping pair of hands. The young king said nothing to disturb the assumption. He walked the galleries of the Louvre with a composure that was no longer that of a hesitant boy. He sat through his council with the same watchful reserve he had shown for years. He had spent his whole life in the shadow of other men's authority. First his mother's regency, then the cardinal's long tutelage, and he had learned, above every other lesson, precisely how much power a minister could accumulate when a king was content to let him hold it. He had watched Mazarin gather to himself a fortune greater than the crown's own, and he had drawn his conclusions in silence. 22 years old, schooled in patience by the most accomplished dissembler of the age, he waited for the one event that would clear the last obstacle from his path: the death of the man who had governed in his name since he was a child of 4. For 17 years the boy had waited. Through terror and exile, through a love he was ordered to surrender and a wife he was ordered to take. He had learned the cardinal's every lesson, and he had learned the one the cardinal never meant to teach, that he would never again let another man hold the reins of France. On the 9th of March, 1661, Cardinal Mazarin died, and the ministers of France, gathering as they always had to ask who would govern now, discovered that the quiet young king had been waiting for exactly this. The Council of State met on the 10th of March, 1661, the day after the cardinal's death, to learn what the young monarch intended. The great men of the realm, the survivors of the Fronde, the ministers and secretaries who had served Mazarin, all of them expected a continuation of the familiar order. They looked for a new first minister to rise, a man they could court, lobby, or maneuver around, a figure who would draw to himself the storms of governance and leave the king his ceremonies. They did not expect what they received. When the 22-year-old Louis addressed them, he did not ask for their guidance. He told them how things would now stand. There would be no first minister. He would govern in person. Every order of the realm, every dispatch and petition and grant of money would pass through his own hands before the royal seal was set to it, and the ministers would report to him and to no one else. He instructed the secretaries of state to sign nothing without his command. It was a quiet revolution, delivered without raised voices, and the men who heard it were slow to grasp that it was meant in earnest. They had been prepared to serve a king. They had not been prepared to serve a king who intended to be his own chief minister, and to remain so for the rest of his life. He set himself to the daily labour of it at once. Where his father and grandfather had left the drudgery of government to their cardinals, Louis met his councils on a fixed schedule, week after week. He read the reports himself, questioned the secretaries himself, and let it be known that no order carried weight unless it had passed beneath his own eye, and, to the surprise of a court that had expected the assertion to fade, it did not slacken. The habit of personal rule, taken up in the spring of 1661, would hold for more than half a century. Among those present was the most conspicuous man in France, Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finances. Fouquet was a figure of enormous reach and even larger appetite a patron of poets and painters who had assembled a private fortune that seemed to rival the treasury he administered. He had helped keep the crown solvent through the worst years of the civil wars, borrowing on his own credit when the state had none, and he had grown accustomed to being indispensable. He had also grown incautious. He had fortified the island of Belle-Île off the Breton coast into something that looked uncomfortably like a private stronghold. He had gathered around himself a following of writers and clients bound to his favour. He carried himself as a man who could not be dispensed with. In the pattern of the old France, where an overmighty subject secured himself by becoming too magnificent to touch, Fouquet appeared to be positioning himself as the next Mazarin. The test of that confidence came in the high summer. On the 17th of August, 1661, Fouquet received the king and the whole court at his country seat of Vaux-le-Vicomte for a fête that every guest who attended would afterward remember as a standard of unreachable splendour. To build it, Fouquet had gathered the finest talents of the age, the architect, Louis Levaux, who had raised the château, the painter, Charles Lebrun, who had covered its ceilings with allegory, and the garden-maker, André Lenôtre, who had reshaped the earth into terraces, parterres, and long avenues of water. There was a banquet served on gold and silver, a new comedy performed in the open air, and fireworks that broke above the gardens and doubled themselves in the canals. For a single evening, the king walked through rooms and vistas more perfect than any the crown itself possessed. Fouquet had meant the night as a monument to his own indispensability, proof laid before the sovereign that the state could not do without the man who could summon such wonders into being. He had miscalculated entirely. He had shown his king a magnificence greater than the king's own, paid for with wealth whose sources would not bear examination, and he had done it in the presence of the whole court. The splendour of Vaux was not a gift. It was, to the eye of a suspicious young ruler, already schooled to distrust the powerful, a confession. The king said little that evening. He moved through the rooms with a mask of courteous appreciation, but observers close to him noted a cold precision beneath it. He looked at the tapestries and the fountains and the gold, and he weighed what they must have cost and where the money had come from. He looked, too, at the men who had made it all, Levaux, Lebrun, Lenôtre, and marked them not as the servants of a subject, but as the makers of a magnificence he intended to command himself. The blow fell less than 3 weeks afterward. On the 5th of September, 1661, at Nantes, where the court had travelled, and the king had summoned Fouquet on the ordinary business of the realm, Louis gave the order for the superintendent's arrest. The task went to the second lieutenant of the king's musketeers, Charles de Batz-Castelmore, D'Artagnan, a soldier of iron discretion. The arrest was sudden and complete. Fouquet was seized, his papers were impounded, and the vast apparatus of his life was pulled down around him in a single day. The trial that followed dragged on for some 3 years, a slow and public ordeal in which the fallen minister defended himself with an eloquence that won him more sympathy than the king had bargained for. The letter-writer Madame de Sévigné, a gossip of genius who followed the proceedings closely, recorded the anxiety and the reluctant admiration the fallen minister stirred in those who watched him fight for his life. The tribunal of judges appointed to try him weighed the charges of embezzlement and, at the last, drew back from death. It voted for banishment. Louis refused the verdict of his own court. In an act with little precedent, he commuted the sentence upward, not down toward mercy, but up toward severity, and condemned Fouquet to perpetual imprisonment. The man who had staged the greatest entertainment of the century was carried to the remote mountain fortress of Pignerol, high in the Alps on the frontier of Savoy, and there he remained until his death in 1680, though the exact circumstances of his end were murky enough that not every account agreed upon them. Into the space Fouquet had filled stepped the man who had quietly assembled the case against him, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Colbert was the opposite of the fallen superintendent in every visible way, a man of ledgers and inventories, tireless, austere, and suspicious of display, whose relentless capacity for work matched the king's own. He took the finances in hand, exposed the tangle of Fouquet's accounts, and set about reordering the whole machinery of the French economy around the royal will. He brought manufacture under state supervision and founded or expanded royal workshops, the tapestry works of the Gobelins among them, to clothe the crown in French-made luxury rather than foreign imports. He raised tariffs to protect home industry, labored to standardize the chaos of local weights and measures, and poured money and organization into a navy that had barely existed. He chartered great trading companies to carry French commerce to the East and West Indies and set the crown's credit behind roads, harbours and canals so that goods and revenue might move more freely through the kingdom. His was a doctrine of national wealth as an instrument of national power, and it bent the productive life of the kingdom toward a single end, the greatness of the king. And the men who had built Vaux did not fall with their patron. Le Vaux, Le Brun, and Le Nôtre were gathered into the king's own service, their gifts turned from the private vanity of a subject to the public glory of a sovereign. The king had seen what one overreaching minister could raise out of the wealth of the realm. He was already turning the thought over toward something larger. West of Paris, on ground his father had used for hunting, stood a modest brick lodge in the middle of marsh and forest, unpromising, waterlogged, half forgotten. It was, to a builder of ambition, a blank page. Fouquet had made one unforgivable error. He had outshone the king. And in the France that Louis intended to build, there would be room for exactly one source of light. As the superintendent vanished into a mountain fortress from which he would never return, the young king was already looking at the men who had made Vaux so beautiful, the architect, the painter, the gardener, and thinking of a swampy hunting ground west of Paris where his father had once kept a lodge. If a subject could raise a palace like that, the king would raise one the world had never imagined. But first, he would need to become something more than a king. He would need to become the sun. The transformation from a man into a myth was not a sudden epiphany, but a systematic work of artifice, carried out over years by a king and the talents he had gathered to his service. Having taken the government into his own hands, Louis XIV set about making his person into an image, a spectacle so ordered and so radiant that his authority would seem less a matter of politics than a fact of nature. The chosen emblem of that image was the sun. In the classical vocabulary the reign now adopted, the sun was the source of life and the guarantor of order, the single body around which all others moved, the light that governed the day and drove back the disorder of the night. Louis took the sun as his personal device and gave it a motto in Latin, Nec pluribus impar, not unequal to many. The claim was a dense and deliberate one, dating from the 1660s, that here was a radiance capable of lighting more than a single world, a power that could face the combined strength of many rivals without being diminished. The king did not merely proclaim the identity, he performed it, and had done so since boyhood. Long before Versailles, the court had staged elaborate ballets in which the king himself danced, and Louis had shown from his youth a marked gift for it. In the Ballet de la Nuit, mounted in 1653 in the very aftermath of the Fronde, the 14-year-old king appeared costumed as the rising sun, gold about his person, stepping into the light as night gave way to day. The production unfolded across the whole span of a single night, in a long succession of scenes, and its climax gave the young king to the audience as the dawn itself, the sun ascending to drive the darkness from the world. The choreography was not idle amusement. To the assembled aristocrats who watched from the dark of the hall, many of them freshly reconciled rebels, the image carried a plain message. Order had returned, and it wore the face of their king. He went on dancing in the court's productions until the dignity of his maturer years made such display unbecoming, but by then the sun had passed from the stage into the whole apparatus of the state. The machine that produced the reign's glory was elaborate and well-staffed. Charles Lebrun, raised to the office of first painter to the king, directed the visual life of the crown with something close to total authority. He shaped the decoration of the royal palaces, presided over the Académie Royale de Peinture et de Sculpture, and oversaw the Gobelins, where the crown's own workshops wove tapestries, cast bronzes, and fashioned furnishings whose every surface returned to the theme of royal magnificence. Alongside the painters worked the men of letters, a body that came to be known as the Petite Académie. A small committee of scholars and writers was set to the task of managing the king's image in words and metal, composing the Latin inscriptions for public monuments, devising the mottos, and designing the medals that carried the reign's triumphs, struck in bronze and silver, to every court in Europe. In time, these were gathered into an official series, a medallic history intended to fix the reign in metal for a posterity that had not yet been born. Beside the medals flowed an unbroken stream of state portraits, engravings and busts, each fashioning the royal features into the same emblem of majesty and multiplying it across the kingdom and beyond its borders. Poets, historians, and academicians were pensioned to sing the reign in verse and record it in prose. Every victory in the field, every treaty, every ceremony was gathered up, refined, and reissued as further proof of the king's greatness. It is out of exactly this atmosphere, the reign as a thing endlessly narrated by its own hired voices, that the most famous saying ever hung upon Louis was born. The world remembers him for 3 words: L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. It is the line that has defined him for 3 centuries, the perfect motto of the perfect autocrat, a man who acknowledged no boundary between his own person and the machinery of government. Yet the words are almost certainly invented. They appear in no reliable record of his lifetime, in no contemporary memoir, in none of the reports of the ambassadors who watched him closely. They surface only long afterward, traced by historians to writers of the early 19th century. The earliest known appearance belonging to the historian Le Montet, more than 100 years after the king's death, who read the phrase back into a reign that had by then hardened into legend. From there it spread, repeated and re-repeated, until the world took it for something Louis had actually said. It is a myth mistaken for a man, a slogan the age never heard him speak, fitted to him by a later age that found it apt. What the reign actually built was not a slogan but a weapon, and it was aimed with precision. The gold lavished on ceilings and costumes, the pensions paid to poets, the medals scattered across Europe, all of it worked to fix every eye upon a single centre, and by fixing them there, to disarm. By making his own person the sun of the court, the king compelled the high nobility to orbit him for their light. The great families who had once raised armies against a boy king were drawn into a competition for his notice, measuring their standing by their nearness to his chair and by the honours of his household, the right to attend him, to hand him a garment, to hold a candle at his rising. Ambition that might once have hardened into conspiracy in the provinces was spent instead on the small intrigues of the antechamber. This was the political purpose the propaganda served, and the surviving ballets, medals, and portraits show plainly enough at whom it was directed, at the class that had nearly destroyed the crown in the king's childhood. The radiance had a price, and it was not paid by the king. To sustain the display, and alongside it the growing army that the same glory required, the kingdom had to be squeezed for revenue year upon year, and the weight of that taxation fell hardest upon a peasantry already living close to the edge of subsistence. Their hardship found no place in the verses of the Académie or the allegories on the ceilings. The brilliance of the court was designed precisely to draw the eye upward and elsewhere, toward the blaze at the centre and away from the country that funded it. Both things were true at once, and they were the same story. The most dazzling court in Europe, and the fields taxed thin to pay for it. And yet the flowering was no mere illusion painted over hunger. The same programme that gilded a king's image also drew to Paris and to his palaces the finest painters, architects, dramatists, and craftsmen of the age. It raised academies, endowed learning, and made French taste and the French language the standard against which the courts of Europe would measure themselves for 100 years to come. The splendour was genuine, and so was its price. They were not two histories, but one. Nor was the sun the sum of the man. The image was a construction of paint, verse, and pensioned genius, and it is on the documented products of that construction, not on any private confidence of the king's heart, that the reign's design can be read. What can be said with certainty is what the machine did. It took a monarchy that had twice been humbled by its own great subjects and remade the king into the fixed point of the realm, the one source of legitimacy, reward, and meaning, whose favour was the only currency that mattered, and whose displeasure was a kind of exile. In controlling the images, the language, and the written history of his own reign, Louis had made himself not merely the ruler of France, but the author of how France was to be seen, the director of a performance that would run, without interruption, for more than 50 years. The world would remember the boast the king almost certainly never made. "I am the state," and forget how carefully the state had been taught to say it for him. For the sun was not a feeling, it was a machine, built of paint and verse and pensioned genius, and aimed at the great families who had once made a boy king flee his own capital in the night. Radiance was the weapon, but a weapon must be wielded somewhere, and Louis had already chosen the ground. West of Paris, in the mud and marsh where his father had hunted, the greatest gilded cage in the history of Europe was rising from the earth, and he meant to summon every proud noble in France to live inside it. Versailles was the answer to the Fronde, built in stone. The rebellion of Louis XIV's childhood had taught him that the danger to a king of France lay in his own great nobles, men who, left to themselves in their provinces, could raise private armies, gather grievances, and turn upon the crown as they had turned upon a boy in his bed. The king's response was not to crush that nobility, but to domesticate it. A nobleman kept busy, kept watched, and kept anxious for the royal glance was a nobleman who could not raise a rebellion. The theatre for this transformation was the least likely ground imaginable, a modest brick hunting lodge his father had built in a stretch of marsh and forest west of Paris, a site so waterlogged and unpromising that a practical man would have left it to the reeds and the mosquitoes. Into that marsh Louis poured the treasure of France, and out of it, over the better part of 30 years, he raised the single most extravagant palace in Europe. The work was not a single act of creation, but a decades-long obsession running through the 1660s, the 1670s, and the 1680s. Under the architect Louis Levaux, the old lodge was wrapped in a grand new envelope of stone. After Levaux's death, the work passed to Jules Hardouin-Mansart, who expanded the palace along its enormous garden front and gave it the vast wings and dependencies that made it a seat of government as much as a residence. André Le Nôtre, the master of gardens, did not so much landscape the grounds as subdue them, forcing the earth into geometry, parterres ruled into symmetry, forests cut through with straight avenues, water gathered into canals and flung upward in fountains that strained the limits of the age's engineering. Water itself became one of the great problems of the reign, dragged from distant rivers and reservoirs across miles of country to feed the basins and jets, a labour that taxed the crown's engineers for as long as the king lived. Thousands of labourers, soldiers, and artisans converged on the site in a churning, continuous campaign of building. The human cost of that labour went largely unrecorded in the king's own accounts, but it was real. Draining the marsh and hauling the endless stone was dangerous work, and construction on such a scale over so many years exacted a toll in lives that the reign was in no hurry to number. By 1682, the great removal was complete. Louis formally transferred the court and the central government of France out of the restless, distrusted streets of Paris and into the ordered isolation of Versailles. It was a political stroke disguised as a celebration of art. By fixing the machinery of the state inside a palace to which only he controlled the entry, the king brought the powerful of the realm under his own unblinking eye. To hold office, to win a pension, to advance a family's fortunes, a man now had to be present. And to be present was to be watched. To be absent was to be forgotten, and to be forgotten was to lose everything that mattered. The capital was left behind. Paris, which had twice risen against him in his childhood and driven the court into the winter dark, kept its parliament and its crowds and its restless streets. But it no longer kept its king. For the rest of the reign, Louis would enter the city rarely, governing France instead from a palace of his own making, on ground he had chosen in part precisely because it was not Paris. The boy who had feigned sleep while the mob filed past his bed now ruled at a careful distance from the people who had made him afraid. At the ceremonial heart of the palace lay the Galerie des Glaces, the Hall of Mirrors, built between roughly 1678 and 1684. It was a masterpiece of political stagecraft. Along one wall, 17 tall arched windows looked out over Le Nôtre's gardens. Along the other, 17 answering arches were filled with hundreds of mirrors, so that the light and the greenery outside were caught and multiplied within, dissolving the boundary between the palace and the conquered landscape beyond it. Overhead, the vault carried Charles Le Brun's great painted cycle, which did not merely decorate the room, but narrated it. The king shone in the guise of a Roman hero, his campaigns and treaties rendered as allegory, his reign set forth as the summit of the age. A foreign ambassador received in that gallery walked the length of a room built to overwhelm him, surrounded on every side by the reflected image of a power that appeared to have neither edge nor end. Yet the truest genius of the cage was not its architecture, but its ritual. Within the palace, the king's day was ordered into a tight and unceasing choreography of etiquette that stripped the high nobility of independence and replaced it with a frantic, competitive hunger for proximity. Much of the most vivid description of that machine comes from the Duc de Saint-Simon, a memoirist whose brilliance was matched by a deep aristocratic resentment of a king who had reduced his class to courtiers, and whose portrait of Versailles, written well after the events, must always be read with that bias in view. Saint-Simon described the levée, the ceremony of the king's rising, as the supreme theatre of the reign. To be permitted to hold a candlestick, to pass the king his shirt, to carry the basin for his washing was no servant's chore, but a prize contested among the greatest houses of France. He recorded, too, the reverse of the honour, how a nobleman whom the king affected not to recognize because he was too seldom seen at court was a nobleman already halfway to ruin. These were the bars of the cage. A duke, whose ancestors had commanded provinces and raised troops against the crown, now spent his days threading a labyrinth of precedents, anxious over which stool he might sit upon, in whose presence, at what hour, whether he might enter this chamber or must wait in that corridor. If the king's eye fell upon him with favour, the day was a triumph. If the king turned away, the world contracted, and the whole exhausting performance had to be paid for. To keep pace with the court, a great family had to spend without limit on dress, on equipages, on the gaming tables, where fortunes changed hands in a night, until many of the proudest houses of France were sunk deep in debt, bound to the palace not only by ambition but by the ruinous expense of the very life it demanded of them, and unable to withdraw to economize without vanishing from the king's sight, and so from favour altogether. The cage, in this way, locked from within. Its inmates could not afford to stay and could not afford to leave. The financial strain reached the crown itself. While Colbert and his successors laboured to wring from the kingdom the revenue that the palace and the reign's endless wars consumed, the treasury stood in a condition of near perpetual siege. What Versailles truly cost across those decades is genuinely disputed by historians, and no honest figure can be given without acknowledging how much is guesswork. What is not in doubt is the scale, an outlay so vast, sustained over so long, that it stands among the defining expenditures of the entire reign. The palace was not merely a residence. It was a device for the domestication of a nation's aristocracy, and it drank the wealth of the kingdom to sustain a myth of absolute control that required constant and expensive renewal. Louis presided over all of it with a calm, exacting attention. He had mastered the names, the lineages, and the loyalties of the court, and he governed the whole ceremonial system as its unmoving centre. He had learned from the Fronde that his nobles were dangerous only when they were left alone in their strongholds, free to nurse ambition and dream of revolt. By drawing them into the orbit of Versailles, he had rendered them harmless, turned would-be rebels into rivals for the honour of his mourning shirt. He had broken the independence of the French aristocracy not with the sword, where his predecessors had failed, but with the subtler and more lethal pressure of ceremony and the irresistible gravity of the royal presence. It was the most beautiful prison ever built, and its inmates fought for the honour of being held. A duke who might once have raised an army against the crown now schemed for a year to win the right to hand the king his shirt at dawn. Louis had taken the terror of his childhood and turned it inside out. He had gathered the great nobles of France into one gilded room where he could watch them all and made them grateful for the cage. But a court is not only ceremony. Behind the mirrors, in the perfumed dark, the Sun King kept another life entirely, and the women who shared it would bring his glittering court closer to ruin than any rebel ever had. The marriage of Louis XIV to Maria Theresa of Spain in the summer of 1660 had been a contract of state before it was anything else, a seal pressed upon the peace that had ended a generation of war between the two great houses of Europe, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. The bride was the daughter of Philip IV of Spain and Louis's own double first cousin, a woman of quiet, rigid piety whose world narrowed to her chapel, her needlework, and the small circle of Spanish attendants she had carried north with her across the Pyrenees. She spoke French imperfectly and seemed, by the account of nearly every contemporary who watched her, perpetually bewildered by the scale and the coldness of the court into which she had been delivered. She would bear the king 6 children in the years that followed, and she would bury 5 of them in infancy. Only the eldest, the boy they called the Grand Dauphin, lived to grow up. She was, in the strict architecture of the monarchy, the Queen of France, and she was, in every way that touched the king's own heart, a stranger in his house. Louis paid her the formal, punctilious courtesy her rank demanded. He did not share his life with her. His restless affection and his hunger for a companionship the Queen could not give ran elsewhere, into the strange, half-acknowledged institution that the French court had made of royal love. The first of the women to hold it was Louise de la Vallière. She was, in almost every particular, the opposite of the courtiers who surrounded her, shy to the point of suffering, devout, reluctant, and possessed of a modesty so genuine that it baffled a court trained to read every gesture as ambition. By the testimony of those who knew her, including Madame de Sévigné, the letter-writer, whose gossiping brilliance remains one of our sharpest windows onto these years, and whose judgments must be read as the vivid partialities they are. La Vallière had not come to the king's side to gain anything. She had come, they said, because she loved him, and it was precisely that absence of calculation that held Louis to her through the middle years of the 1660s. He made her a duchess. She bore him children quietly acknowledged and drawn into the crown's care. And all the while she carried her place as a wound rather than a prize, tormented, by every contemporary account, by the conviction that she had traded her soul for a passion that was already cooling around her. In 1674, her place lost and her spirit broken, La Vallière did what almost no royal favourite had ever done. She left. She withdrew to the Carmelite convent in Paris, took the veil, and exchanged the apartments of a duchess for a bare cell and a life of penance. She would remain there for 36 years until her death in 1710, a woman who had once been the chosen favourite of the Sun King and who spent the whole second half of her life on her knees seeking pardon for the sin of having loved him. Her flight into the cloister exposed, more starkly than any scandal, the strange machinery she had served. For the maîtresse en titre, the official mistress, was in Louis's France almost an office of the court, a recognized and semi-public position with its own apartments, its own influence, and its own uneasy proximity to the throne. Maria Theresa was expected to receive her husband's mistresses, to sit with them, to endure their presence at mass and at table, and to bear the whole arrangement in silence. She did. Her devotion never wavered, and her humiliation, borne without complaint, was one of the quiet constants of the reign. Into that office, as La Vallière faded from it, stepped a woman of an entirely different temper. Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart de Mortemart, the Marquise de Montespan, was everything her predecessor was not: beautiful, quick, imperious, armed with the celebrated wit of her family, and wholly without La Vallière's paralyzing guilt. If Louise had been a candle, Montespan was a conflagration. From the later 1660s into the closing years of the 1670s, she reigned over the king's private hours as though the title of favourite were a throne of its own, and for the better part of a decade she was, in all but name, the uncrowned Queen of Versailles. She kept her own dazzling apartments, larger and finer than the Queen's. She gathered artists and poets and architects around her. She set the fashion and the temper of the court. The memoirist Saint-Simon, that brilliant, merciless, and profoundly biased observer, an aristocrat who never forgave the monarchy for humbling his class and who wrote his portraits years after the events they describe, would remember her as an imperious and grasping presence, the very embodiment of a court corrupted by favour. His hostility must be weighed on every page, yet even discounting his malice, the scale of her ascendancy is not in doubt. She bore the king a succession of children through those years, and their fate revealed how far the institution of the royal mistress had grown into the very body of the dynasty. These were the children of the left hand, and Louis did not hide them. Those who survived were legitimized by royal act, given great titles and the standing of princes, and settled at court to be raised alongside the true-born heirs. Their upbringing was entrusted to a discreet, intelligent, and devout young widow, Madame Scarron, born Françoise d'Aubigné, the widow of a satirist and a woman of no fortune of her own, whom the world would later know as Madame de Maintenon. It is a name to hold in mind, for the governess of the mistress's children would in time eclipse the mistress who had borne them. In time, these children of the mistresses would be raised to titles and settlements and married into the highest ranks of the blood royal, so that the offspring of an illicit passion were woven quite deliberately into the succession of the oldest throne in Europe. So the household of the Sun King arranged itself into a tableau at once magnificent and strange. The pious queen at the ceremonial centre, silent and sidelined, her one surviving son, the Grand Dauphin, standing as the single legitimate heir on whom the whole future of the dynasty rested. The reigning mistress ruling the king's hours from her painted rooms, and between them a nursery of legitimized children, threading the blood of the favourites into the line of France itself. It was a domestic order no ordinary family could have borne, and only a king with Louis's command of ceremony could have held it in such perfect public balance. But no favour under Louis was ever secure, and by the later 1670s the ground beneath Montespan had begun to shift. The king's eye had started to wander toward younger rivals, and, more gravely, toward the sober, watchful governess who was raising his children and who offered him something the brilliant marquise never had. Montespan felt the change. A court that lives on proximity to a single man reads the smallest coolness like weather, and the brittle glitter of Versailles filled with unease. It was said the king had grown moody and complained of obscure ailments. It was said the fading mistress, sensing her decline, had begun to seek means of holding him that lay beyond beauty and wit. Such talk belonged for the moment to the corridors and the letter-writers, the class of witnesses whose word can never be taken whole. But it was drifting towards something darker than the ordinary intrigue of a court. Paris, the city Louis had spent his life avoiding, kept secrets that the gilded walls of Versailles could not shut out. It was a place of shadows and desperate remedies, where the poor and the frightened sought to master their fates through fortune-tellers and charms, and where, it was murmured, women in the back alleys traded in prophecies, love philters and powders that could bind a straying lover or hasten an inconvenient death. For a long while such murmurs stayed in the streets beneath the notice of the great. Then slowly they began to climb. For years the court had watched the king move between his women, as between rooms in his own palace. The wronged queen, the penitent who fled to a convent, the mistress who ruled from her painted apartments. It looked like the ordinary sin of kings. It was not, for some of those apartments had been reached by a stranger road than love, through the back rooms of Paris where women sold powders and prophecies and worse, and where, it was whispered, a great lady of the court had gone to buy the king's desire, and perhaps a rival's death. In 1677 the police lit a torch in those back rooms. What they found would reach all the way to the foot of the throne, the reach of the sun. King's authority had always been measured in the clarity of his edicts and the discipline of his armies, but beneath the polished floors of Versailles a more subterranean power had begun to surface. It rose into view with the execution of the Marquise de Brinvilliers in 1676, a woman of high birth whose patient, systematic use of arsenic to clear her path to an inheritance sent a tremor of horror through the capital. Her trial was a public spectacle, but it was merely the opening of a door. Once the authorities began to peel back the layers of her enterprise, they found not a lone monster but a thriving shadow trade of chemists, fortune-tellers, and purveyors of what the parlance of the day delicately termed inheritance powders. Over the years that followed, roughly from 1677 into the early 1680s, the investigation widened under the cold, methodical gaze of the Lieutenant General of Police, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, and the trail led away from the gutters and toward the gilded gates of the court itself. What had begun as the prosecution of a single high-born poisoner was becoming an inquiry into a whole hidden economy of the capital, a traffic in prophecy, filters, and secret death that seemed to run, thread by thread, into some of the greatest houses in France. La Reynie followed each thread with a patience that spared no one. Where the ordinary courts might have hanged a few sorcerers and closed the file, he kept pulling, and the deeper he pulled, the higher the case climbed. At the centre of this web stood Catherine de Chaise, known to all as La Voisin. She was a figure of singular and terrifying industry, a midwife, an abortionist, a fortune-teller, and the most prominent dealer in the dark commerce of the city. Her clients were not merely the desperate or the criminal. They were, according to the testimony gathered against her, great ladies of the realm, the wives and mistresses of men who stood near the king. They came to her seeking more than prophecy. They came for love philters to secure a wandering eye, for powders to be rid of a rival, for a future that would not be denied them. La Voisin's rooms became a confessional for the ambitions of a whole slice of Parisian society, a place where the ordinary rules seemed briefly suspended, and it was the reach of her clientele, more than the squalor of her trade, that turned a criminal inquiry into a matter of state. As the arrests multiplied, the affair took on the character of a panic. Fortune-tellers and self-styled sorcerers were seized across the city. Each interrogation named others, and the role of the accused lengthened until it seemed to implicate half of fashionable Paris. The alarm reached the king himself, and in 1679 Louis sanctioned the creation of a special tribunal to deal with the rot, the chambre ardente, the burning court. It was an extraordinary instrument, sitting apart from the ordinary courts, empowered to move with the swiftness and intensity of the fire to which it might condemn. Under the direction of La Reynie, its machinery ground on for years. Hundreds of arrest warrants were issued, dozens of the accused were condemned, to death, to the galleys, to banishment. And the whole proceeding was conducted apart from the ordinary courts, in an atmosphere of secrecy and dread. It gathered into one net the fortune-tellers and the sellers of powders, the renegade priests and the desperate wives, and it treated the trade in poison and the trade in the occult as a single conspiracy against the natural order. Crucially, much of its evidence was drawn out under interrogation, under the threat and the fact of torture, a method that produced confessions in abundance and truth only sometimes. A frightened prisoner promised her life for a great enough name could be relied upon to supply one, and the tribunal, hungry for a villainous core to the affair, was disposed to believe her. La Voisin herself was brought to the stake on the 22nd of February, 1680, and burned before a Paris that had followed her case with fascinated horror. She died without laying bare the full extent of her patronage, but her silence in the fire could not halt the momentum of the inquiry. In the months after her death, as the tribunal pressed on, and fresh testimony was wrung from those still in its cells, the accusations climbed toward the very bedchamber of the king. The Marquise de Montespan, the mother of Louis's legitimized children, and the reigning favourite of his affections for the better part of a decade, was named. Here the historian must set the record down with the greatest care, for everything that followed against Montespan belongs to the realm of the alleged and never to the realm of the proven. The charges were as lurid as they were grave. Testimony, most notably that extracted from La Voisin's own daughter, Marguerite, claimed that Montespan had bought love philters to keep her hold on the king, and even that she had taken part in sacrilegious masses, black rites performed to bind his desire. It must be said plainly and said more than once, these were accusations, not established facts. Montespan was never charged. She never appeared before the tribunal. No contemporary record confirms the black masses as anything other than the confessions of the condemned, and those confessions were produced in a chamber built for terror by prisoners with every reason to name the great in the hope of saving themselves. To repeat the sensational version as history is to mistake the fever of the Chambre Ardente for its findings. What is certain is only that the whisper reached the throne. Whether there was anything true beneath it, no one has ever been able to prove. However uncertain the substance, the danger was real, and the court felt it as a physical thing. Madame de Sévigné, whose letters caught the pulse of these years with a gossiping brilliance that must itself be read with caution, recorded the dread that settled over the salons of Versailles. Great families feared that a stray name in a ledger, a servant's confession, a rival's malice would bring the king's investigators to their own door. The blaze of the reign seemed, for a season, to be dimmed by the smoke of the burning court, and Louis was forced to confront the fact that the poison, whether real or only rumoured, had seeped up out of the streets and to the very edge of his own household. What was proven remained squalid but small, a network of poisoners and charlatans, tried and punished. What was alleged reached the throne and could never be proven at all. He acted, as he had acted since the days of the Fronde, as the state rather than as the man. He understood that to let a royal mistress be publicly bound to the poisoner's trade, or to drag the mother of his children before a tribunal, would be a humiliation the crown could not survive, and that a scandal reaching the throne itself would corrode the very image of an untouchable monarchy that his whole reign had been built to project. Whether he believed the charges against Montespan or dismissed them, the calculation was the same. The thing could not be allowed to be spoken aloud in a courtroom. And so he closed the pit himself. He narrowed the tribunal's scope. He ordered the most explosive dossiers sequestered. He directed that the testimony touching the highest ranking of the accused be set aside and buried. The Chambre Ardente was permitted to finish its work against the minor players, the midwives, the fortune-tellers, the sellers of powders, but its teeth were quietly drawn long before it could close on the hand that had fed it. The records of the investigation were suppressed, sealed, and in many cases destroyed by royal command. A portion survived the fire and the lock, but the full truth of the affair went into the dark with the rest, and it has never been wholly recovered. The king had looked into the pit beneath his own court, and he had chosen not to see the bottom. The tribunal was quietly smothered, the most dangerous testimony locked away, and the woman who had ruled his heart for a decade was never made to answer the whisper that she had fed him love in a poisoned cup. What was true and what was torment wrung from the condemned, no one would ever be certain. But the affair had taught Louis something colder than any lesson of the Fronde, that even here, in the blazing heart of his own reign, there were secrets a king could only survive by burying them. And not far away, in a mountain fortress, he was already keeping the most famous secret of them all, a prisoner whose face no one was permitted to see. The legend of the prisoner is perhaps the most enduring shadow cast by the Sun King, a story so potent that it has come to eclipse the man himself. For 300 years the image has held, a figure sealed inside a heavy mask of iron, locked in the lightless depths of the Bastille, a living secret whose very existence threatened the crown. It is a tale of Shakespearean proportions, royal bloodlines and dark statecraft, a face too dangerous to be seen. And yet, like so much of the glory that radiated from Versailles, the legend is a construction, a literary ghost story that has gradually been mistaken for the history of the 17th century. To find the real prisoner, one must first strip away the fictions that have been laid over him. The reality, as always, is more granular and, in its quiet way, more haunting. The man who died in the Bastille on the 19th of November, 1703, was indeed a prisoner of extraordinary secrecy. He had been held for some 34 years, moved like a piece of state baggage from the fortress of Pignerol high in the Alps, to the remote garrison of Exile, to the island prison of Sainte Marguerite off the southern coast, and at last, in 1698, to the Bastille itself, carried through it all under the watchful, weary charge of a single jailer, Benigne d'Auvergne de Saint-Marc, who rose in the king's service precisely as the guardian of this one nameless man. When the prisoner died, he was buried the following day under the false name of Marchioli. His few possessions were burned, the walls of his room scraped and whitewashed, and every trace of his long, silent habitation methodically erased from the world. The secrecy travelled with the man. Wherever Saint-Marc was posted, the masked prisoner went too, and the orders that hedged him about did not slacken with the years or the changing of the fortresses. The same care that had sealed him at Pignerol in the rain's confident noon still sealed him in the Bastille a generation later, when the king was old and his wars had turned against him. Few things in the long life of the monarchy were guarded so patiently, or for so little apparent reason, as the identity of this one nameless man. History remembers him as the man in the iron mask, a title that carries the cold weight of metal and the cruelty of eternal silence. But the iron is a fiction, a late accretion that belongs to the imagination of the Enlightenment and the century after it, not to the administrative records of the Bourbon state. The iron entered the story through the pen of Voltaire, who, writing decades after the prisoner's death, seized on the tale to cast Louis XIV as a tyrant of Gothic dimensions and hardened the cloth of the legend into metal. Later still, the novelist Alexandre Dumas would go further and turn the prisoner into the king's own secret twin, a mirror image cast into the dark to protect the legitimacy of the throne. It is a magnificent story. It is also entirely and unequivocally an invention. The twin brother plot has no basis whatever in the record and belongs to fiction alone. The primary evidence we possess, set down with the dry precision of a man keeping a register, tells something plainer. An officer of the Bastille named Du Junker noted in his journal that the prisoner, when he was moved or seen in company, wore a mask of black velvet, not iron, but cloth. It was no cage for the head, but a soft, close covering, and it served the same purpose an iron frame would have served, to hide the face, to render the man an anonymous cipher, while possessing none of the industrial horror that the later storytellers required. The truth was quieter than the legend, and for that reason perhaps more chilling. The simple, total erasure of a human identity, accomplished not with a smith's rivets, but with a length of black velvet and a jailer's discretion. That so much care was taken to hide one face is itself the heart of the mystery, and no amount of debunking dissolves it. Saint-Marc did not guard crowds. For the better part of his career, he guarded above all this one prisoner, following him from fortress to fortress, as though the man were a state treasure that could not be left behind. The orders that governed his keeping were extraordinary in their severity, and it is from their very extremity that the enduring question rises: what could a single obscure captive have carried in his head that was worth so many years, so many walls, and so complete a silence? The archives of the Ministry of War offer a name, though not a certainty. In 1669 an order was issued for the arrest of a man called Eustache d'Auger, a valet of obscure origins, to be held under the strictest confinement at Pignerol. He was permitted to speak to no one but his jailer. He was to be told that if he ever tried to speak of anything beyond his immediate needs, he would be killed on the spot. The surviving instructions that governed his keeping are remarkable precisely for their disproportion, the machinery of a great state bent, with extraordinary deliberation, upon the silence of a single servant. And it is that disproportion, more than any romance, that has kept scholars circling the case for 3 centuries. For this reason Eustache d'Auger has become the leading candidate for the man behind the velvet, the identification best supported by the surviving documents. But it is a leading guess, not a proven fact, and honest history must say so. Over the centuries, other names and other theories have been advanced. A disgraced diplomat privy to the king's foreign secrets, a servant who had stumbled upon a scandal too dangerous to survive, and figures grander still. None has been established beyond dispute. The debate is genuinely open, and the valet's identity, like the reason for his silencing, remains, after 300 years, unresolved. The mystery endures because it mirrors the broader arc of the reign. The Sun King built a world of light, and light requires shadow to exist. The greater the brilliance of the facade at Versailles, the deeper the darkness that had to be maintained behind the curtain. The prisoner in the velvet mask was the ultimate expression of that logic. A secret that could never be told, a human cost that could never be acknowledged, a testament to the truth that the king's authority lay as much in what he concealed as in what he displayed. The mask was not merely a device to hide a face, it became in time the image of the whole reign, total visibility for the monarch and total darkness for anyone whose existence threatened the carefully curated story of a kingdom without blemish. We must be careful, even so, not to make the tragedy grander than it was. The prisoner was not a hero, nor need he have been a political martyr. He may have been simply a man caught in the machinery of a state that had no room for him. His 34 years of confinement represent a cold, persistent, and almost mundane cruelty, the kind that thrives not in dungeons of the imagination, but in the quiet corridors of bureaucracy, requiring no drama, only a patient and iron-willed commitment to erasing a life from the record of the kingdom. That, in the end, is what makes the case more disquieting than the legend Voltaire and Dumas built upon it. An iron mask and a royal twin are the stuff of tragedy, and tragedy can be admired from a safe distance. A length of black velvet, a false name over a grave, and a stack of orders filed neatly in a ministry are something else, evidence that the same power which could raise Versailles from a marsh could also, with no more fuss than the signing of a letter, unmake a man entirely and leave the world none the wiser. Strip away the iron that was only velvet, and the twin brother who never existed, and what remains is stranger than any novel, a real man, his name perhaps Eustache d'Auger, kept masked and nameless for 34 years by the most powerful king in Europe, and buried at last under a lie. We will never know for certain who he was, or what he knew that was worth a lifetime of silence, but the image he left behind became the truest portrait of the reign itself. A face no one was allowed to see, hidden behind something beautiful, at the command of a king who had learned to bury whatever he could not afford to have looked at. And there were greater things than one prisoner that Louis could not afford to have the world look at too closely. There was, for a start, the war. The ambition of Louis XIV was not merely to rule, but to organize the very air of Europe around his own authority, and he understood early that such a project required a mechanism more reliable than the shifting loyalties of noblemen. He found his instrument in the army and his architect in François-Michel Le Tellier, the Marquis de Louvois. Where earlier French kings had leaned upon disparate regiments raised and owned by private captains, Louis and Louvois built a machine of state. They regularized the ranks, standardized the equipment and the drill, imposed a clearer chain of command, and, most crucially, asserted the king's own control over the promotion and the payment of the officers who served him. By the 1670s, Louis commanded the largest, most disciplined, and most efficiently supplied force on the continent. War, which had once been a chaotic gamble of aristocratic honor, was becoming a calculation of logistics, supply, and the relentless application of professional force. The reign was measured out in the rhythm of these campaigns, each one justified by the king's lawyers as the recovery of an ancient right or the settling of an unpaid debt. When Louis launched the War of Devolution in 1667, he did so in the name of his wife, Maria Theresa. He argued that the Spanish Netherlands, by the custom of certain local provinces, ought to have devolved to her upon the death of her father, Philip IV of Spain, and he had not forgotten that her promised dowry had never been fully paid. It was a legalism, cold and precise, dressed over an appetite for territory. The French columns marched into Flanders with a speed that startled a Europe still accustomed to slow and sputtering campaigns, and within a season a string of fortress towns had fallen. The brief war closed in 1668 with France enlarged along its northern frontier. It was a beginning, not an end, and every neighbor understood as much. It was here that Sébastien le Prestre de Vauban became the true master of the king's wars. A man of engineering genius, Vauban turned the conduct of sieges into his science of geometry. He moved the army away from the heroic, wasteful assault and toward the patient work of the spade, the digging of zigzag trenches that crept ever closer to a wall until the strongest fortress became the inevitable victim of the cannon and the mine. And as he conquered, he built. He ringed the northern and eastern frontiers of France with a belt of star-shaped bastion strongholds, the ceinture de fer, the iron belt that served at once as springboards for further advance and as barriers against the counterattacks his master's ambitions were sure to provoke. War, in Vauban's hands, became a matter of lines drawn on a map, and earth moved by the ton. Yet it was not enough for the Sun King to win. The world had to be made to see that he won with a divine and effortless radiance. He brought the finest artists of the age to chronicle the campaigns. Adam Frans van der Meulen followed the royal carriage, recording the movement of the troops, the fall of ramparts, and the king himself, mounted and composed, always poised and always in command amid the smoke. The Gobelin's works wove these scenes into vast, shimmering panels of silk and gold. In the halls of Versailles, the king's victories were frozen and cleansed, stripped of the mud, the stench, the camp fever, and the cries of the dying, and presented instead as a choreographed sequence of imperial triumphs. The reality was, as always, more terrestrial, and the gap between the deed and its image was itself a deliberate work. In 1672, Louis launched his assault on the Dutch Republic, a war meant to humble the one power he judged insolent enough to obstruct his commercial and political reach. The crossing of the Rhine became the central legend of the campaign, an epic feat of arms in which, so the poets sang, the French swam a great river under a storm of enemy fire. The truth was more modest. The water was low, the passage was barely opposed, and the Dutch were caught unready by the sheer scale of the advance. But the machine of glory was already turning, and it inflated a manageable operation into a labour of Hercules, a proof that the king could bend even the elements to his will. The war itself was neither brief nor tidy. It ground on until 1678, when the treaties of Nijmegen brought it to a close and left France larger still, its gains confirmed, among them the rich province of Franche-Comté, and its reputation as the terror of Europe fixed beyond argument. The cost of this machine was not merely in the treasure it devoured, though that was immense. The glory was bought on credit, and the bill was pressed upon the most vulnerable. To keep such armies in the field, the state reached deeper into the purses of the peasantry than any French government had dared before. Taxes, levies, and the requisition of grain became a near-permanent emergency. In the border provinces, the coming of one's own army could be a greater calamity than the coming of the enemy. Soldiers were quartered in private homes, consuming the winter stores of the poor and turning whole local economies into supply lines for the king's designs. When the harvests failed, the war did not pause, and the villages were left to hunger in the shadow of the very fortresses raised to shield them. What all of this cost in lives can only be estimated, and the figures for the age are uncertain, but the weight of it was borne, as such weights always are, far from the gilded rooms where the campaigns were planned. As the wars continued, the resentment across Europe hardened into resolve. Louis had succeeded in centralizing France, but he had also, by the same stroke, begun to unify his enemies. The Dutch, the Spanish, the Austrians, and in time the English drew together, driven by the cold recognition that no single state could stand alone against the French machine. Every victory abroad seemed to conjure a new and more determined opponent. Every province annexed tightened the ring around the kingdom that had taken it. The glory was genuine, the conquered territory was real, and the military power of France was truly the envy of the age. But it was a power that demanded constant maintenance, constant expansion, and constant fear in order to sustain itself. The king held himself apart from the misery it produced. He viewed the state as a single coherent body of which he was the head, and he required every limb to serve the purpose of the crown. In the memoirs he composed as instruction for his son, a curated, self-justifying account of his own craft of kingship, he set down his conviction that a ruler's first duty was the pursuit of grandeur, since the reputation of the state was its surest security. He did not read the hunger of the provinces as a verdict on his own policies. He read it rather as a necessary price for the survival and the greatness of the French name. He lived in the light of the sun he had commissioned, a light that seemed to burn all the brighter for the darkness kept carefully at its back. Yet the cracks were already showing. The wealth of the kingdom, vast as it was, could not indefinitely carry the cost of permanent war, the upkeep of the greatest court in history, and the appetites of the ministers who served it. The treasury was becoming a pit without a bottom, and the credit of the crown was being mortgaged to the financiers who grew rich on the king's necessity. Each campaign, each new fortress, each new tapestry added to the burden on a population nearing the limit of what it could bear. And all the while the king remained fixed on the horizon, seeking the next frontier, the next town to be invested, the next map to be redrawn in his image. On the tapestries, the king rode eternally forward, calm above the smoke, and Europe learned his name the way one learns the name of a storm. But glory is bought on credit, and the bill was already coming due. In the granaries, emptied to feed the army, in the frontier villages that woke to soldiers in their kitchens, in the slow, gathering resolve of every neighbour France had frightened. Louis had made himself the greatest power on the continent. He had also made himself its common enemy, and as his armies marched, he was preparing a blow against his own subjects that would horrify even the courts that hated him, and drive the most useful people in France into the arms of his foes. The religious peace that had held France together for nearly a century was a fragile, man-made architecture, resting entirely on the Edict of Nantes. Henri IV had granted that edict in 1598 to close a generation of religious slaughter, the long civil wars that had culminated in massacre and left the kingdom soaked in the blood of its own people. It was a compromise born of exhaustion, an acknowledgement that the Huguenots, the French Protestants, could not be eradicated without tearing the nation apart. It had never been a charter of tolerance so much as a truce between two Frances too spent to go on killing one another. But as the sun of Louis XIV reached its zenith, that old pragmatism began to wither under a new and colder clarity. The king had come to see his own glory as the reflection of a single divine mandate, and in that light the very existence of a religious minority read as a flaw in the smooth, unbroken surface of the state he had spent his life polishing. A realm with one king, one law, and one faith could not, by the settled logic of the reign, suffer subjects who looked elsewhere for their salvation. The strategy of the long squeeze began not with a sudden blow, but with 1,000 small suffocating cuts. Across the provinces, the king's ministers and the local intendants, who governed in his name, set about reading the old edict with deliberate malice, narrowing every clause until the letter of the law strangled its spirit. Protestant temples, the churches where the Huguenots worshipped, were suddenly found to violate some obscure ordinance and marked for demolition, stone by stone. The professions were shuttered one by one. Huguenots were barred from the law and from medicine, expelled from the guilds that governed the trades, shut out of the printing houses and the municipal offices, forbidden even to serve as midwives. Their children became a battleground, for the crown decreed that a child of 7 might renounce the faith of its parents and, on that pretext, be taken from them to be raised a Catholic. It was a systematic effort to render a Protestant life in France slowly impossible, to make the price of conscience a permanent second-class existence. And as the noose drew tighter, the state began to hunt for a way to hasten the harvest of souls. The instrument it chose was the dragonade. It began in the province of Poitou in 1681 and spread outward across the south and west, a weapon of casual state-sanctioned cruelty. The king's dragoons, rough-mounted soldiers, were quartered in the homes of Huguenot families and granted a license to behave as they pleased. They were told that their hosts were heretics and that the king's favour would be measured in the conversions they could wring from them. The soldiers turned the hearths of industrious households into scenes of ruin. They smashed furniture and fouled provisions, seized what they wanted, and kept their hosts from sleep night after night, with drums, shouting, and worse, until the exhausted family agreed to abjure. They were the king's guests, sent to break the peace of the home from within. The records that survive, filtered through the terror of the victims and the bland reports of the intendants, describe a population worn down past resistance. Hundreds of thousands set their names to papers of conversion, swearing to a faith they did not hold, only to make the soldiers leave. On the ledgers of the state it was counted a triumph, abjurations by the province, souls reclaimed by the tens of thousands. In truth, it was a mountain of paper, and everyone at court knew it. The pressure reached its breaking point in October 1685. In the chateau of Fontainebleau, Louis put his name to the edict that revoked the Edict of Nantes outright. With a stroke of the pen, he declared that the legal existence of French Protestantism was at an end. The temples that still stood were to be pulled down, the Protestant schools closed, and the ministers, the pastors, banished from the realm within a fortnight, on pain of the galleys. And then came the cruelest clause of all. Where the ministers were driven out, the laity were forbidden to follow. Ordinary Protestants were prohibited from leaving the kingdom under threat of the galleys for the men and imprisonment for the women. The edict locked them inside a burning house and commanded them to embrace the flames. It was an act of supreme confidence, a belief that the king's will was so absolute it could reach into the private conscience of his subjects, and, where it could not, could at least bind their bodies to the soil of France. The results measured out the limits of even his power. Despite the explicit ban on emigration, the exodus began at once and could not be stopped. It was a hemorrhage the crown was helpless to close. Men and women of skill, weavers and dyers, printers, clockmakers, silversmiths, merchants, and hardened army officers abandoned houses, workshops, and fortunes to slip across the frontiers in the dark. They travelled in disguise, hidden in hay carts and in the holds of merchant ships, carrying little but their tools and a permanent hardening hatred of the king who had betrayed them. An estimated 150,000 to 200,000 fled, and by some counts the true number ran higher still. They settled in the Dutch Republic and in England, in Switzerland, across the Atlantic, in the Americas, and in the German lands of Brandenburg, Prussia, whose elector threw open his territories to them in that very same autumn, welcoming the refugees as a gift of skilled hands and eager soldiers. Every Huguenot who reached Amsterdam or London or Berlin became a living reproach to the Sun King and a living asset to his rivals. And those who could not run did not always yield. Many who had set their names to the papers of conversion remained Protestant in secret, and in the rugged country of the south, whole congregations, soon to be known as the Church of the Desert, kept the forbidden faith alive at clandestine assemblies held in the hills, under threat of the galleys for the men and the convent for the women, and, for the pastors who dared to preach at them, of death. It was a staggering wound to France and very largely self-inflicted. The king had cut away a productive sinew of his own merchant and artisan class and handed its skills to the powers arraying against him. The refugees carried more than trades, they carried a cause. In the pamphlet presses of Holland and England they told and retold the story of the Dragonnades, and their testimony did more to blacken the name of Louis XIV across Protestant Europe than any defeat in the field. Many of the exiled officers and their sons would return to the continent in enemy uniform, and Huguenot soldiers would stand in the ranks that fought French armies in the wars to come. It was a cost no historian can fully reckon, but it was felt in the emptying workshops of the provinces and in the swelling strength of the king's enemies for the rest of the reign. Yet within the gilded confines of the court the same act was seen through an entirely different glass. The king was surrounded by voices that returned his own righteousness to him amplified. His confessors, his advisers, and his court poets were eager to frame the revocation as the crowning proof of his piety and his authority, the deed that redeemed a life of worldly glory and set the seal of heaven upon the reign. They cast him as a new Constantine, the emperor who had made an empire Christian, a defender of the true faith who had at last brought a fractured realm into a single fold. The Catholic pulpits of France rang with the comparison. The great preachers praised him, the poets versified his zeal, and the king, ever attentive to the verdict of posterity, appears to have accepted that he had won a moral victory to set beside his military ones. He had traded away a portion of his kingdom's prosperity for the ideal of a single, seamless France. He had tried to erase the shadow that a minority cast across his perfect surface, and had only lengthened it across the remainder of his reign. The court poets called it the greatest act of his reign and compared the king to Constantine. The Catholic pulpits of France rang with praise. But Louis had done a thing no enemy army had managed. He had torn a wound in France that would never fully close and driven perhaps 200,000 of his most skilled subjects into the workshops and regiments of the very powers now arming against him. He had mistaken cruelty for greatness and uniformity for strength. In the Palace of Mirrors the reflection still blazed as bright as ever. But the man at its centre was changing, growing older, graver, more afraid for his soul, and into the space where the dazzling mistresses had reigned, a quiet, pious widow was already moving, close enough now to become the most secret wife in France. The transition was not a sudden eclipse, but a slow and cooling shadow. For decades the court had been a theatre of appetite and display, a place where the king's desires and his hunger for glory were very nearly the only laws that governed the day. Yet even the most brilliant sun must cross its meridian, and by the early 1680s the atmosphere of Versailles had begun, almost imperceptibly, to change. The king was entering his mid-40s, and his attention was drifting from the fleeting triumphs of the ballroom and the campaign towards something steadier and more austere. At the centre of that slow turning stood a woman who seemed, in nearly every particular, the opposite of the glittering mistresses who had gone before her. Françoise d'Aubigné had come to the heart of power by one of the strangest roads in France. She had been born in 1635 within the walls of a prison at Niort, where her father lay confined for debt, and she was the granddaughter of Agrippa d'Aubigné, the fierce Protestant soldier poet who had fought and versified for the Huguenot cause a generation before. She had known hardship and dependence long before she knew the corridors of a palace. As a girl she had been passed among relatives and convents, and once nearly pressed to take the veil for want of any other provision. Her first marriage, made while she was still in her teens, bound her to Paul Scarron, the celebrated comic writer, an invalid crippled and racked with pain, whose salon was among the wittiest in Paris. There, keeping his house and enduring his infirmity, she acquired the composure, the discretion, and the sharpened intelligence that would become her only fortune. Scarron's death left her a widow of little means, sustained for a time by a modest royal pension. Then came the appointment that changed everything. She was engaged quietly to raise the children the king had fathered on Madame de Montespan, the legitimized sons and daughters who could not be reared openly at court. It was work that demanded absolute secrecy, endless tact, and a gift for managing proud and difficult tempers, and she performed it superbly. As the affair of the poisons threw its long shadow across the king's private world, and as the scandal and his own growing unease loosened Montespan's brilliant grip, the discreet governess rose steadily in the king's regard. In the quiet of the nursery, Louis seems to have found something the dazzling favourites had never offered him, a companion who did not clamour for power, a counsellor who did not demand to be adored in public, a woman whose steadiness rested on a faith as genuine as it was disciplined. He raised her, buying the lands and the title that made her Marquise de Maintenon, the name by which history would know her, to the Duc de Saint-Simon, the king's most obsessive and most hostile chronicler, an aristocrat writing years afterward with the bitterness of a man whose caste had been tamed and diminished. She was a cold schemer who had crept into the king's bed by playing the saint, the architect of a joyless and suffocating court. His portrait crackles with malice and must be read as the testimony of an enemy. What can be said with more confidence is that the king's own deepening taste for order, discipline, and observance found in Maintenon a ready mirror, and that the two of them, both drawing toward old age, moved in the same grave direction. The decisive change in the king's private life followed a death. When Maria Theresa, his long-suffering queen, died on the 30th of July 1683, the court expected the customary interval of mourning and then the usual manoeuvring toward a new and prestigious royal marriage, another Habsburg or another Infanta to seal some treaty. Instead, the king did the unthinkable. By the autumn he had resolved on a course that defied the expectations of his ministers, his family, and the whole watching aristocracy of Europe. On the night of the 9th to the 10th of October 1683, in a small and hushed ceremony witnessed by only a handful of trusted intimates, Louis XIV married Françoise d'Aubigné. She was some 3 years older than the king and no longer young herself, a widow past 40, marrying a widower who had ruled for a lifetime. It was a morganatic union, a marriage valid in the eyes of the Church, but deliberately kept from the eyes of the world. She would not be crowned, she would not be proclaimed queen, she would never be entered in the official records as his consort. In public, she remained the Marquise de Maintenon, keeping her own apartments and the outward posture of a favoured servant, while exercising an influence that would slowly reshape the tone of the whole court. Under her presence, the frantic tempo of Versailles began to slow. The great fêtes and carousels that had defined the younger king's reign grew rarer, giving way to a quieter and more decorous manner of life. The king, who had once filled his hours with the hunt and the dance, now spent his evenings in Maintenon's rooms, his ministers' dispatches and portfolios spread on a table between them, working through the business of the kingdom in her company. In the evenings she would sit at her needlework while he laboured, and the great gallery emptied earlier than it once had. The court, as courts do, followed where the king led. Devotion became the new currency of favour. The chapels filled. The open displays of vanity that had been the hallmark of the Sun King's noon were tempered by a new and sombre emphasis on duty and religion. It would be a mistake to imagine the change as her invention alone. The king was aging, and the great mistresses and the poison scandal lay behind him, but it moved unmistakably in her direction. Maintenon poured her own energies into the work that would become her most lasting monument, the Maison Royale de Saint-Louis, the school she founded at Saint-Cyr near Versailles in 1686. It was created for the daughters of poor noble houses, girls of good blood and no money, many of them left destitute by the very wars that had paid for the king's glory. There, in a disciplined and pious establishment, some 250 of them at a time were to be educated and given a future. It was an act of real charity, though her detractors, forever hunting for the calculation behind any kindness, insisted it was one more way of binding the loyalty of the lesser nobility to herself. For its pupils, the playwright Jean Racine, coaxed out of a long silence, composed 2 biblical dramas, Esther and Athalie, to be performed by the girls themselves before the king and his intimate circle. Among the last flickers of the old theatrical splendour, its genius now turned from myth and empire to sacred ends. The true extent of her political power has never stopped being argued. Saint-Simon and the other memoirists laid every shift of policy, every appointment, every turn of the king's religion at the door of her private council, painting her as the puppeteer behind a failing monarch. Yet Louis was not a man who let himself be governed, and never had been. It is nearer the truth to see the marriage as a partnership of 2 disciplined and aging people who had arrived, by different roads, at the same conception of what a Christian king and a Christian court ought to be. Maintenon did not manufacture the king's convictions. She furnished the settled, sober world in which they could harden and grow. And yet, for all the quiet she brought to his private hours, the world beyond the palace was turning hard against him. The peace of the middle reign was fraying. The restless expansion that had marked his younger years had frightened and antagonized every neighbor France possessed, and the resources of the kingdom were being drawn thin. The king, whose every gesture had once been studied across Europe with envy, now found himself watched instead, with fear and gathering hostility, his glory hemmed in on every frontier. He had drawn back into a more private, a more devout old age, seeking to square the account of his life with his God, but the reckoning of his reign was about to demand a last and ruinous payment. The most Catholic king in Europe had married in a candlelit room, and before 2 witnesses, a woman born in a debtor's prison, and told no one. She would never wear a crown, never be named queen, never appear in the official histories as his wife. She was the great secret of his old age, the widow who governed his conscience, if not his kingdom. Under her the fountains played less often, and the chapels filled, and the aging Sun King bent his splendor toward heaven. But the God he was courting had already begun to take from him. Across the Rhine and the Channel and the Pyrenees, the powers he had frightened for 40 years were closing their ranks at last, and the longest, most ruinous war of his life was about to begin. The peace that followed the revocation of the Edict of Nantes was a fragile and hollow thing, bought with the forced silence of those who remained and the flight of those who fled. It was not a peace that Europe would allow to last. By the late 1680s, the long resentment of the Sun King had hardened into a single continental purpose. For decades, Louis had pushed outward, annexing enclaves along his frontiers, pressing his lawyers' claims through the so-called Chambers of Reunion, seizing the free city of Strasbourg in a time of nominal peace and treating his own will as the law of the border. He had at last overreached. When his armies moved into the Rhineland and menaced the Holy Roman Empire once more, the final diplomatic pretense that France was merely defending herself fell away. In 1688, the League of Augsburg took the field against him, the Emperor and the German princes, Spain, Savoy, the Dutch Republic, and, once William of Orange had crossed to seize the English throne, England as well. For the first time, nearly the whole of the continent had combined against one man. The war that followed, the 9 Years' War, was a long, grinding, indecisive ordeal that stretched the French crown to its limits. It was not a war of brilliant, deciding strokes, but of sieges, marches, and the deliberate destruction of the land. In the winter of 1688 and 1689, to deny the enemy any base or supply, the French command carried out the systematic devastation of the Palatinate, putting its towns and villages to the torch. Heidelberg, Mannheim, Worms, and Speyer went up in flames, and a smoking wasteland was left where the Rhineland had been. It was a calculated act of war, and it stained the name of Louis XIV across Germany for generations, recasting the refined master of Versailles as a figure of cold-blooded ruin. When the Treaty of Ryswick was signed at last in 1697, the exhausted combatants had little to show for a decade of misery. The map of Europe had barely moved. It had been a war fought to a standstill, and it proved only the prelude. The true shadow over the continent lay not on the Rhine, but beyond the Pyrenees. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg to rule in Madrid, was a broken invalid, his body and mind wrecked by generations of intermarriage, and he could father no heir. His empire was the greatest inheritance in the world. Spain itself, the Spanish Netherlands, great tracts of Italy, and the silver kingdoms of the New World, and the question of who would receive it kept every chancellery in Europe awake at night. Should the whole of it pass to the Austrian Habsburgs, France would find herself ringed by a hostile power on every side. Should it pass to the Bourbons, the old balance of Europe would simply cease to exist. When Charles II died in November 1700, his will astonished the world. He had left everything, the entire undivided inheritance, to Philip, Duke of Anjou, the second grandson of Louis XIV. It was the gamble of the age. After days of deliberation, the king accepted the bequest on his grandson's behalf, and the young man set out for Madrid to be crowned Philip V of Spain. In the moment, it looked like the supreme triumph of Bourbon fortune. But it carried within it the seed of a general war. Louis's next moves, securing French commercial advantage in the Spanish colonies, and on the death of the exiled James II, recognizing his son as the rightful king of England, persuaded the maritime powers and the emperor that the Sun King meant in the end to bind the crowns of France and Spain into one overmastering empire. The War of the Spanish Succession broke over Europe in 1701, and this time the coalition against France was all but total. England, the Dutch Republic, the Empire, and their allies bound themselves into a grand alliance, and they had found the commanders to make it deadly: John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, and the imperial general Prince Eugene of Savoy, a soldier born in France who had carried his genius into the emperor's service. The war moved off the frontier and struck toward the heart of the French sphere. The myth of French invincibility, so carefully woven by Le Brun and the painters of the court, began to come apart in smoke and blood. At Blenheim on the Danube in 1704, Marlborough and Eugene together shattered a French and Bavarian army and took a French marshal prisoner with the better part of his force, a defeat so complete that it stunned Versailles and announced to all of Europe that the age of French dominance was ending. 2 years later, at Ramillies in 1706, Marlborough broke the French line in the Low Countries and swept through the Spanish Netherlands. At Oudenarde in 1708, the French were beaten and driven back once more, and the great fortress of Lille, one of Vauban's masterpieces, fell after a long siege. Then in 1709 at Malplaquet, the two armies met in a slaughter beyond anything the age had witnessed. The Allies held the field at day's end, but at so ruinous a price, tens of thousands of dead and wounded heaped in the mud, the bloodiest single day of the whole war, that the victory very nearly unmade the victors. France was no longer fighting to expand. She was fighting to survive, and the kingdom behind the armies was starving. The winter of 1709 was the cruelest in living memory, a great frost that turned the rivers to stone, killed the seed in the ground, and destroyed the harvest across the realm. Famine spread through the provinces, and subjects, who had once been the proud people of a glorious sun, were reduced to eating roots and grass. From the gilded quiet of Versailles, the old king was forced to look on the ruin his wars had helped to make. To keep his soldiers in the field, he ordered even the gold and silver plate of the palace melted down and sent to the mint, a gesture that fed no one but laid bare the bankruptcy of the state. When Louis at last sued for peace, the terms the Allies laid before him were designed less to end the war than to humiliate him. They demanded not only that he give up his grandson's claim to Spain, but that he send his own armies to drive Philip from Madrid by force. It was an impossible thing to ask of any man, still more of a grandfather and a king. To agree was to make war on his own blood. To refuse was to leave France open to invasion by armies already gathering on her northern border. Louis refused. But he fought this last stretch of the war in a way he had never fought before. He had a letter read from the pulpits of the kingdom, addressing himself directly to his people, setting out the terms he had been offered, and calling on them to endure the famine and the taxes a little longer and to stand with their king. It was the nearest thing to a public appeal he ever made, and the irony was lost on no one at court. The monarch who had built his whole majesty on distance was now asking his hungry subjects for their patience and their trust. He would have it. Against every expectation, the kingdom did not break, the frontier held, the shattered armies were rebuilt, and the war ground on for 4 more bitter years until exhaustion on all sides brought it to a close. The turn, when it came, was the work of Marshal Villars, who in 1712 caught an overextended Allied army at Denain and beat it, lifting the immediate threat to Paris and buying France the breathing room to bargain from something better than her knees. By the treaties of Utrecht in 1713 and Rastatt in 1714, Philip V was left in possession of Spain and its colonies, but on the single condition that bound the whole long tragedy together. The crowns of France and Spain were never to be joined on one head. Louis had kept his grandson on a throne and lost very nearly everything else. France emerged from the longest war of the reign victorious in the narrowest sense and ruined in every other. Her treasury empty, her people bled and hungry, her glory spent. He had begun his reign as the terror of Europe. He would end it fighting for survival on his own soil, his armies broken at Blenheim and bled white at Malplaquet, his treasury empty, his people starving, and his enemies demanding that he turn his own sword against his own grandson. The Sun King, who had once made kings tremble, now wrote to his governors and begged the people of France to suffer a little longer. And as if the ruin of the kingdom were not enough, the God whom Maintenon had taught him to fear was preparing the cruelest stroke of all. Not against France, but against the old man himself, in the one place no army could defend, his own family. The winter of 1709 arrived not as a season, but as a judgment. It came in the first days of January, a cold so sudden and so absolute that it seemed to freeze the very spirit of the kingdom, and it held France in its grip with 2 brief false thaws that only killed what the first freeze had spared for the better part of 2 months. In the gardens of Versailles, the fountains that had once danced in defiance of nature fell silent, their pipes split by the ice within them. The great orange trees, the pride of the king's collection, blackened and died in their glass galleries. But the ruin of a garden was nothing beside the silence that came down over the provinces. Across France, the rivers turned to stone, the Seine, the Rhône, the Garonne froze hard enough to bear carts and men, and along the coasts the very sea was said to have iced. Travellers froze on the roads, birds were found dead in the frozen air, wine turned to ice in the cellars, even, it was said, at the king's own table. The earth set like iron, and locked the seed of the coming harvest beneath a crust no plough could break. When the thaw came at last, it brought no mercy, only the knowledge that the life had been scoured out of the land. The vines and the olives, the wheat and the rye, the very foundations of French bread and French sustenance, had perished in the deep. What followed was the great hunger. As the weeks became months, the price of grain climbed out of reach, until bread was a luxury for the rich, and its absence a sentence of death for the poor. In the villages, the starving ate boiled roots, then grass, then the bark stripped from the trees. In the towns, they died in the streets, and the morning watch found the bodies frozen where they had fallen. In Paris, the price of a loaf climbed past the reach of the labouring poor, and the dead were carried from the meanest quarters in numbers the parish registers could scarcely keep. The famine spared no province and asked no questions of loyalty or creed. It fell alike on the faithful and the rebellious, and the state that might have relieved it was itself a hollow shell, its treasury scraped bare by the endless expense of the war, of the Spanish succession, so that hunger and taxation and conscription pressed down together upon the same exhausted people. Contemporaries reckoned the dead of that year in the hundreds of thousands, some in the millions, across France and beyond her borders. No ledger of the age can give the true figure, and the number is past recovering. Louis, an old man now of 70, read the reports of the catastrophe from the gilded distance of his palace. The whole account of his reign, the wars he had launched, the fortresses he had raised, the splendor he had commanded, stood indicted by the plain fact of a starving people. In a gesture that later writers have read as both a genuine sacrifice and a sign of the state's terminal desperation, he ordered the gold and silver plate of Versailles carried to the mint and melted down, and set an example that some of his courtiers, more or less willingly, followed with their own. It was an act of penance in precious metal, and it fed no one. The war went on demanding to be fed. The taxes stayed merciless. The recruiting sergeants kept taking the sons of the villages, and the gulf between the radiant image of the Sun King and the reality of his dying subjects widened into a chasm no decree could close. The king lived as he had always lived, in a world of protocol and paper. But the mortality of his own blood was about to strip away the last defences of that ordered world. For all his labour to make his dynasty secure, the architect of the future was about to watch the future taken back from him. The first blow fell in the spring of 1711. The Grand Dauphin, Monseigneur, the king's only legitimate son to reach manhood, a heavy, cautious man who had spent his whole life waiting in his father's shadow for a crown that never came near, fell ill with smallpox, and on the 14th of April, at the age of 49, he died. He had sickened at Meudon, his own chateau beyond the capital, and was gone within a few days. The death of the heir struck the court like a physical shock, a tear in the expected order of the succession. Louis, who had lost his own father as a small child, now stood in the stranger position of a father who had outlived his grown son and his king-to-be. He was given no time to grieve. The court, that vast engine of watchfulness and gossip, turned at once to the new heir, the king's grandson Louis, Duke of Burgundy. Burgundy was a man of intense piety and quick, nervous intelligence, a former pupil of the Archbishop Fenelon, and the hope of all those who longed for a gentler and more devout France to follow the old king's wars. But the year that had taken the Dauphin brought a second season of disease behind it. In the early weeks of 1712, death returned to Versailles, and it came first for the one the court could least spare. Marie Adélaïde of Savoy, Duchess of Burgundy, the king's favourite, the young woman whose gaiety had been almost the last warmth in his darkening rooms, sickened of a swift and virulent measles and died on the 12th of February. The king was shattered. Saint-Simon, the memoirist who watched these deaths with an eye as merciless as it was sharp, and whose account must always be weighed as the work of a partial and self-interested witness, set down the old man's grief as a thing of terrible, silent dignity. And the horror was not finished. The Duke of Burgundy, sick with the same fever and inconsolable at his wife's death, followed her into the grave 6 days later, on the 18th of February. He was 29. Within a single week, the king had lost his grandson and the wife his grandson had loved, and the succession that had lately seemed so broad and safe now hung by a single thread. Burgundy had left 2 small sons, the Duke of Brittany and the little Duke of Anjou, and the sickness reached for them too. The elder, the Duke of Brittany, died within a few weeks in the following month, so that the entire future of the House of Bourbon came to rest on the frail and sickly life of the younger, a child of 2, the boy who would one day reign as Louis XV. That the child lived at all was something close to chance. He too was struck by the same measles that had carried off his parents and his brother, and, by the account that has come down, he was saved only because his governess, the Duchesse de Ventadour, shut the door on the physicians and their lancets and would not let them bleed him as they had bled the others into their graves. The king stood at the centre of a palace that had become a house of the dead. He had buried his queen, Maria Theresa, nearly 30 years before. He had watched his mistresses rise and fade, and now he watched his own line cut down within a handful of years, generation after generation, by a scythe that recognized no royal title and heard no command. In the span of a single year, the black-draped coffins had gone out from Versailles for the Dauphin, for the Duchess, for the Duke, and for the little Duke of Brittany, 4 in procession to Saint-Denis, where there should have been none at all. He had been called a son, and had believed it as much as any man could, but in these long shadowed days he was only an old man who had outlived his own succession and very nearly everyone he had loved. The dynasty he had meant to stand for centuries was a house raised on sand, and the tide had come in. The cold of 1709 had killed the vines and the olive trees and the poor in their thousands, and it seemed to the old king that God had turned the same winter upon his own house. In 11 months he buried his son, a year later his grandson and his grandson's wife, and then their little boy, the future of the dynasty, carried out of Versailles one small coffin at a time. He had outlived his queen, his mistresses, and now nearly all his heirs, until everything he had built rested on the fragile life of a child not yet out of the nursery. The Sun King had spent 70 years learning that he could command almost anything. He was about to learn the one thing he could not command, and it was already in his own blood. He had outlived his queen, his mistresses, his children, and his grandsons, and in the late summer of 1715, the long, slow winter of his life at last found its closing term. It began, as such things often did in that age, with something small, a pain in the leg, and then a dark blemish upon the skin, the first sign of the gangrene that would carry off the master of Europe. The physicians of Versailles, those men of learning and superstition who had bled him and purged him and dosed him through a lifetime of lesser complaints, gathered at his bedside and found themselves helpless before it. There was nothing in their art to halt the black corruption as it climbed the old man's leg. They debated. Some at last urged amputation, but by the time they dared to weigh it, the decay had spread too far, and there was nothing left to do but wait. The king remained the king to the last hour. By the reports of those who were present, he watched his own dissolution with the same cool, deliberate composure he had brought to the signing of treaties and the ordering of sieges. He put his affairs in order, took his leave of his household, gave instruction for the reign that would follow his own, and insisted that the great clockwork of the court go on turning around his dying bed, that the levee and the coucher, the rituals by which the Sun King had risen and slept in the sight of his nobles for half a century, be observed to the end. Even beneath the shroud he would not let the performance fail. He took his leave of Madame de Maintenon, the secret wife of 30 years, who withdrew from the deathbed to her school at Saint-Cyr to wait out the end apart. There is one act of those final days that the record has kept. The king had his heir brought to him, the child of 5 who was all that remained of the direct line, the boy who would reign as Louis XV, and, according to accounts that survive in several and differing forms, he gave him a last counsel. He was reported to have told the child that he had loved war too much and had built too much, and that the boy should not imitate his great-grandfather in either, that he should govern gently, keep the peace, and ease the burdens under which the Sun King's glory had left his people bent. The exact words shift from teller to teller, coloured each time by what the teller made of the rain, and no single version can be trusted as the very phrase he used. But the substance is consistent across them all, and it is remarkable enough on its own. A man who had raised a monument to his own permanence, warning the future not to walk the road that had built it. He died on the 1st of September, 1715, 4 days short of his 77th birthday. He had reigned for 72 years, since a day in 1643 when he was a boy of 4. No sovereign in the recorded history of Europe had held a throne so long. He had outlasted a procession of popes and the whole span of a century's other kings. The France of his birth, torn by civil war, and governed from behind a child's throne, had become under him the first power of Europe. The crown passed, as he had arranged, to his great-grandson, a child of 5, with the king's nephew, the Duke of Orleans, to govern as regent until the boy came of age. The very kind of royal minority, ruled by others in a child king's name, out of which Louis's own years of terror and flight had once been born. The funeral was not the blazing spectacle of his prime. The body was carried by night toward the royal tombs at Saint-Denis, and the memoirists record that along the road, in and around the city of Paris, the capital he had distrusted and avoided for the whole of his life, the city that had once forced its way into his bedchamber to look upon a frightened boy. The people did not mourn him as a fallen son. They did not line the route to weep. By some accounts, they stood in silence. By others, there were those who jeered the passing carriage or drank and made merry at the taverns along the way, glad to be rid of the wars and the taxes and the hunger. The city that had never forgiven him had, in the end, the last word over the king who had spent his life turning his back on it. 6 decades earlier, a boy of 15 had been crowned at Reims in a kingdom that had twice driven him into the dark. The old king now went to his tomb through a capital that was glad to see him gone. To weigh such a man is to hold the sun and its shadow in a single hand, for the greatness and the ruin are the same story and cannot be pulled apart. He had made a modern centralized state, gathering into the crown's own hands a power the great feudal families had held for centuries, and forging out of a turbulent, half-governed realm a disciplined instrument of royal will. He had made French the common tongue of diplomacy and of the cultivated mind, and had presided over a flowering of art, letters, and architecture so brilliant that the rest of Europe spent the next century trying to copy it, down to the gardens and the manners and the very cut of the clothes. He had founded academies, dug canals, raised state manufactures, and built a navy where there had scarcely been one before. And he had raised the Hall of Mirrors and the palace around it not as a vanity alone, but as an engine of rule, a gilded cage into which he drew the proud and dangerous nobility of France, and held them fast in a golden round of etiquette and precedence, rendering them harmless by rendering them ornamental. That was the achievement, and it was real. But every measure of that gold had been paid for elsewhere, and by someone else. It had been paid in the provinces bled dry to fund the wars, in the frontier villages burned to deny an enemy their shelter, in the hundreds of thousands of Huguenots driven into exile, and the skills and loyalty they carried to his rivals, in the soldiers left dead in the mud of Blenheim and Malplaquet, and in the grass-eating hunger of the great frost, while the fountains of Versailles stood frozen and the plate went to the mint. And it had been paid, too, in a mountain of state debt so vast that it would shadow the monarchy long after the man who ran it up was dust. He had been the sun, and the sun, for all its light, had scorched the ground beneath it. He remained to the end the child of the Fronde. The mask of absolute God-given unassailable majesty that he had worn all his life had first been raised as a defence. armour buckled onto a boy whose own capital had twice driven him into the dark, whose own great nobles had made war upon him, who had once lain still and feigned sleep while a mob filed past his bed. He had spent 70 years answering the memory of that night, and had answered it with a palace, an army, a language, and a legend. He had buried his wife, his mistresses, his son, and his grandsons, and had borne each loss with the same stoic, guarded endurance that gave the watching court nothing to read. He had gilded the present in gold, even as the future slipped one small coffin at a time through his fingers. And nearly all of what we think we know of the private man behind the majesty comes down to us through the memoirists, Saint-Simon above the rest, brilliant and bitter and writing long after the fact, so that even at the last the face is half hidden behind the accounts of those who watched it. He had reigned for 72 years, longer than any king of Europe before or since, and in the end the gangrene took him slowly, 4 days short of his 77th birthday, while the fountain still played and the courtiers still filed past to bed as they had filed past a frightened boy's bed 60 years before. The world would keep the wrong words. I am the state, the boast he never made, and forget the ones he truly spoke as the light went out. I depart, but the state shall remain. That was the whole of him in a single breath. The Sun King had built a nation, a language, a palace, and a legend that would outlast them all. And he had paid for every ounce of that gold in war and famine and exile and grief, and buried nearly everyone he loved to do it. The mask was velvet, and it was beautiful, and beneath it was only a man who had never stopped being afraid of the dark. He was the most magnificent monarch in the history of France. He was also its most cautionary tale. And the legend, as legends do, remembered only the light, and forgot the long shadow it had always, from the very first, been casting.